Morning and welcome to the second session on emerging trends in technology. Thank you for the packed room for the first session, and we hope that it'll get as packed or even more for the second ones and through the rest of the day. We have a power-packed day for you, a day full of demos, a day full of cutting-edge stuff. This session in particular is going to be about overcoming language barriers. Languages have divided us human beings. We have seen it in films, we have seen it all around us for centuries and generations together. It's dividing of civilizations. But now, technology overcomes these barriers. The extent to which languages can divide us is far and deep. Imagine rural Indian women who have no access to technology simply because they are language challenged. That's one extreme. And the other extreme is overserved population like us. We have the privilege to technology, but when you travel to Europe, when you travel to some other parts of the world, you have no way to communicate. So this session, the next 1 hour, is going to be two presentations back to back. One about underserved Indian communities and how gesture-based services can help us overcome language barriers there. And the second one on live translation. Live translation means two voices, two people, but enabled by two more voices by a software program. So it's two people talking with four voices in the room. That's going to be super exciting as well. So stay back and listen in to both these presentations. The first one, I want to welcome Sumita Sharma from the University of Tampere in Finland. She's a researcher there, and she's going to take us through overcoming language barriers by novel gesture-based services for the underserved Indian communities. Welcome.
Thank you. Hi, so like Prerna mentioned, my name is Sumita Sharma. I'm a researcher with the University of Tampere in Finland. Luckily, I'm missing all the snow by being in Bangalore. I work there with this unit called TAUCHI, which is the Tampere Unit for Human-Computer Interaction. And it's a leading research center with multidisciplinary people from different nationalities, and it's the largest and highest ranked academic human-technology interaction unit in Finland. And at TAUCHI, we look at how technology can be designed for the human, focusing on various modalities, and we primarily work in 4 different groups there. There's the speech and gesture-based group, which is the group that I work with. We also have a multimodal interaction group, which looks at haptics, and touch and gestures. We have a visual interaction research group, which looks at gaze-based interaction. And then we have an emotions and sociability group, which looks at how technology can kind of assist and augment human emotions. So the agenda for the presentation today is to talk about the motivation for my own research. And I will then delve into 3 scenarios, 3 very distinct examples of how emerging technologies was employed very successfully to overcome certain challenges that the specific user group was facing. So basically, emerging technologies are changing the way we interact with information. For instance, you have touch, gestures, speech, you have virtual reality systems, although most of it has been used primarily in gaming. What human-computer interaction is trying to do is to see how we can get the next billion information users, that is the next billion users who will be connecting to the internet for the first time. They will be from emerging countries. They will probably also be using a computer for the first time. And human-computer interaction is trying to see how we can help them in this process. Current research is also focused extensively towards mobile technologies, which are also unintentionally targeted towards young adult males in the Indian community. So what I want to look at are communities that are currently underrepresented and underserved, by which I mean women and children. So one of the technologies that I would use, or that I have been using in my research, is the Microsoft Kinect motion sensor. So has a very strong potential in gaming, and I can see a lot of people in the green t-shirt, so just like a big wave to you. But I will be talking about the Kinect 360, not the Kinect 1, that I have been using, and it has an infrared emitter and an infrared 3D depth camera. And the way it works is that the infrared emitter projects a pattern into the room that it's looking into. And then the depth So the pattern would then be distorted based on the object that it lands on. And the depth sensing camera then sees that distortion, is able to have a map of all the objects in the room, including humans. You also have a color camera that is like a webcam, and it captures the video images. And all this, the infrared detection and the color images, are being captured at 60 frames per second. And then you combine them together, and then you can see with every sort of frame if there's movement. So together you're able to get this really wonderful human skeleton, and you get this 3D coordinates for all the joints. The circles are the joints. And the Kinect 360 basically can track 6 people, location for 4 of them, that's the center of mass, which is just below the navel, and then the whole skeleton information for 2 of them. So basically you get, as a developer, you get very nice 3D spatial coordinates for all of these joints that you can track in this sort of 10 cubic meter space at 60 frames per second to see what sort of gestures the users are doing. For pointing gestures, the Kinect 360 also provides this physical interaction zone. And the idea here is that it's a comfortable sort of location in front of the user where you would be pointing. So this area here, which helps interacting with large displays. So if I'm interacting with something that's really large and I'm standing, say, 5 meters away from it, if I want to reach the corners, I don't have to point like that. But I can just very comfortably point according to my own skeleton to this, within this physical interaction zone, and it could be mapped to this very large screen. So it provides a very comfortable way to point and then also have these motion gestures. For instance, like swinging or swiping, and you can have all these gestures through this one device, which is very powerful for a developer to use. Now, what I would like to discuss are the 3 specific cases where I have been able to use this technology in very challenging environments and for very novel sort of ideas. A lot of this research is done in a sort of multi-disciplinary group with a lot of different collaborative partners. So we've had Tauchi, what I represent, and this work was also done with IBM Research in New Delhi and the Indian Institute of Technology in Guwahati. So in India, we know there's an acute shortage of trained physicians. And there's also a lack of culturally sensitive information for rural Indian women for healthcare. So we decided to design a maternal healthcare information system for women who, from rural areas, where there is no requirement for them to read anything on the screen. So they can interact with the system, get very basic maternal healthcare information without the need of actually knowing how to use a computer or how to use the system. So this is our application. So basically the Kinect would see the whole skeleton, and you would see the sort of gestures that the woman is doing. And here, there were 4 possible gestures that were available. So this is about basic healthcare. So you could touch your head and get very basic information about the head. You could touch your neck, your shoulder, or your stomach. So this was like a proof of concept. So we only work with 4 gestures at this point. But obviously, you can see the potential in this application that it could be applied to various other cases. For instance, this could be like the first level of healthcare information that these rural women could kind of be introduced to. So for instance, rural women, you have, so basically what happens is you have maybe one clinic for several villages, right? So if somebody is sick, or in the case of sort of maternal health care, they would have to spend an entire day at the doctor's clinic just for a checkup, which they're not very motivated to do. So then we try to devise a system where you could either have like first level of healthcare information or just general sort of maternal healthcare information that is very relevant for them. And they could also use this collaboratively within a group. So the idea was that you have a 3D avatar who introduces the system and tells them how to use the system, which is just through gestures. And we realized that in the healthcare domain, it's very natural to point to your own body when you want to describe something. So if you go to a doctor and you say, "Mere sar mein dard ho raha hai, I have a headache," you point to your head, you intuitively do that. So we took that scenario and moved it into this health information system, which was tracking these gestures. So we decided to see what works best, these sort of body-centric gestures, or maybe pointing to these visual icons on a menu screen. And we saw that these gestures worked very well within this healthcare domain, and that the users really preferred using gestures. And it was very easy to take that sort of, to take gestures in this context for healthcare, for rural Indian women, and have them access technology without being scared of it. And all the output was in sort of this audio-visual format. So they were videos. So for instance, if you selected something successfully, there would be a video that would provide information about the selection that you made. So these are some of the pictures from the user study that we carried out. We ran a study with over 20 participants from the representative user group. This was done at IIT Guwahati. We were working with rural Assamese women. And like I mentioned, that they clearly preferred touching, sort of these body-centric gestures to pointing in this context. Of course, there can be cases where body-centric gestures are not very appropriate. For instance, outside of a clinic, you don't, or somewhere in a public space where, you are with a lot of different people, maybe of mixed genders, then you probably don't want to be touching parts of your body to interact with the system. But I just wanted to show how this really worked in this very specific context. Okay, so the second case that I want to talk about is gesture interaction for differently abled children. Previous research has established that technology provides an engaging and an immersive learning experience for children who are unable to express themselves verbally. And also there are potential therapeutic and learning benefits for using gestures. There's a professor at MIT called Howard Gardner, and he has this theory of multiple intelligences. So he says that everybody learns in a different way. And one of the ways that we learn is kinesthetically. So we learn with our body. For instance, if you want to learn how to cycle, the only way to do it is to get on a bicycle and ride it. There's no sort of tutorial and no other way to learn it. But then you also have individuals who are unable to learn in other ways. So for instance, children with autism, they find it easier to do things themselves than to be told or to see it visually or to hear it. So for them, this sort of expressing themselves through their body is therapeutic as well as sort of more appropriate. Individuals with autism also lack motivation for social interaction. So current research, there's a lot of research out there on using these technologies for children with autism, but unfortunately, all of it is focused on the individual. So we look at how an individual with autism can possibly connect to other people online, maybe, or use gesture-based interaction to learn new things, but it's always at the individual level. So you have an individual interacting with maybe a very large display, and they will do it alone. They will just be sitting there or standing there and doing it alone. However, we know that children with autism also lack motivation for social interaction. So we wanted to see how we could have these children actually use technology to have these children collaborate socially with someone else. It could be a peer, it could be a caregiver, it could be another adult. So the idea was that the sort of main concern that children with autism have when they interact socially is face-to-face contact or making eye contact. And that is very uncomfortable for them. It's very socially awkward for them to have this sort of eye contact and look at someone's expression and try and decipher what they're trying to say. So we removed that awkwardness by having an application where you had to face the screen. So then you have two people who collaborate through technology, through this screen. So the idea is that you have two people who are facing the screen and they can see their hand by this sort of on-screen cursor. So they could point to these 3 different balloons. And what you have to do, or the game is basically that you can either select a balloon individually, and selection is by pointing with a dwell time of about 2 seconds. Or you should have 2 people select the same balloon together, which is social collaboration. So if you select a balloon individually, you get a star, which is a smaller reward than if you select a balloon together, which is a big rainbow with very sort of magical music that played in the background. So in this way, we have kind of promoted social collaboration through technology. So what I mean by social collaboration here is that for 2 people to select the same balloon, there needs to be some sort of visual or auditory cue to decide which balloon to select. There were 3 balloons on the screen. So either they look at the hand cursor and they decide, okay, if one person is pointing towards the blue balloon, I'll also move my hand to the blue balloon, or there would be some sort of verbal communication where the person would say, where the next person or the teammate would say, okay, let's select the blue balloon, and then they would try and move their hand towards the blue balloon. So in this way, you have motivated a child who completely lacks motivation for social interaction. But with this game, they will try and come out of their shell and try and interact with someone. This was the setup when we ran the user studies for this application. So here you can see a Kinect and a display, and then you have two users who are comfortably apart, yet close enough to interact. These are pictures of the session. The sessions were held in the Tamanna School of Hope in New Delhi, in Vasant Kunj. And here you can see one of the moderators actually helping the child to point. And this we realized was like another form of collaboration that was happening, which was not designed in the application. So you had sort of like a authority figure guiding the pointing. And then the child is more comfortable interacting with the application. The last example that I have is the City Compass application. So here, the idea is that you have traditional classrooms that are evolving into collaborative online learning environments. But younger school children, they still lack this sort of global perspective. They don't have a very wide world view of things. Because they go into the classroom, they only interact with their classmates. They don't really know what's going on in other corners of the world. So we looked at addressing the needs of underprivileged Indian children who do have access to computers within their schools, but lack sort of relevant material in those systems. What they do is they open up Paint and try and write their name or draw something, or they open up an Excel file and input some data. I've actually seen, in computer classes, the teachers hand like mark sheets or something to the students, and they just enter it in Excel and they're learning a skill. So that's not really very relevant to them. It doesn't motivate them to really learn or use technology. So we wanted to see how we can have children from these urban slums in Delhi get excited about using technology for language learning. So the idea was that we had an application that requires two users, a tourist and a guide. And the idea is that you virtually navigate these 360-degree panoramic views of an actual city. And this is the city of Tampere. It's the center of Tampere, where I'm coming from. So the idea is that you have a tourist and a guide. The guide sees this sort of blue line, which is the route. So you arrive to this, you've arrived to this city, and you have to go to this predefined destination. And you do that by navigating through a series of panoramas. So the guide sees the route, and the tourist sees these green arrows, which are the exits, to navigate from one panorama to the next. So then you have this sort of conversation going on, so the guide would say, what do you see? The tourist will say, okay, I see a McDonald's. It's like, okay, do you see a green arrow on the right side of the McDonald's? And then that's how you would start having this conversation. So the idea of this was to see how you promote language learning by being in an environment where that's the only language you can use. So we paired up the people from Finland and India, and the only common language there is English. So the idea was that, if you want to teach somebody how to swim, you just kind of throw them in the pool. So that's what we did with the urban slum children. We connected them to a researcher in Finland and told them, okay, now you have to play this game, and you can only talk in English. There were a lot of assistive cues for them. For instance, we had this thing, as you can see, there's like a text here, and it was also verbally said. So they could point to certain buildings or landmarks and get information about them, because they wouldn't know if it's a hotel or a hospital. So they could point to it and get information about it, and then they could tell the guide that, okay, I see a trash can with advertisement, which is the one that's shown here. And that way you had this sort of conversation going on, even when they were not able to really understand what was going on. And as we've seen in the Indian education system, children are really good at repeating what they hear, even if they don't understand it, and even reading if they don't understand it. So they were actually able to play this entire game, maybe not completely understanding each and every element of it. So the City Compass application actually has several modalities that it supports. The one that we use with the example that I just shared was actually a desktop-based version with the traditional mouse and keyboard. We do have an embodied interaction version where you can use your own body to interact. So over here, then, you pan by tilting your shoulders. That's how you pan a panorama. And then you select things by pointing at them, the landmarks. And then the really fun thing is that to switch between panoramas or to select an exit, you just walk through the entire thing. And then you go to the next panorama. So it's a very immersive environment. And we're looking at how we can have this now set up at the Dipalya school, which is the school that I work with, and in Finland, and have children interact like that. So you have these very sort of large screen displays, and you can have a very immersive environment where you're interacting with somebody from a different country, visiting a different city, it's images of an actual city, and then interacting with your own body. So this is like a scenario that I described earlier in using the application. So the application actually is available online. All of you can go to this URL on the top and try it out. You need to work in pairs, so one will be a tourist and the other one will be a guide. We have support for 3 cities, Berlin, Tampere, and New Delhi. Going forward with this specific application, we're also looking at a virtual reality sort of an interaction. So we have these mobile devices where, for instance, like the Google Cardboard application. So you can have these very virtual environments, and you can use a Google Cardboard and put your smartphone there. So you have all this sort of computing power within the phone, and you can have these very, very immersive environments where you can have a child with sort of a very low-cost hardware, these sort of phones with glasses with lenses, and then just put your phone in it, which has the application. And then the way you move your head and all, you're transported into that environment. And with that, we want to see how this sort of collaboration will work with having children from different parts of the world connecting together and exploring each other's cities. So the idea is that you kind of initiate discussions on culture, on increasing their world view, and also there's also a lot of learning happening through this. So this is an example of what we're doing with the VR setup. These are the sort of glasses that are available. And then you would have panoramic views that would look like the image on the left. Okay, so in conclusion, novel emerging technologies have the potential to help overcome literacy barriers faced by functionally illiterate rural Indian women. It has the potential to provide a means of self-expression to children with autism who face severe social challenges, and it can connect children from different parts of the world for similar educational goals. Thank you.
We have about 5 minutes for questions before the next.
Yes. Yep, go ahead.
I'm Karika from Microsoft Research. So, what is your intuition around, the social challenges when you deal with functionally illiterate women in the rural space? Because we've done some research in that area, and especially with the UI kind of thing, and we find it's not really the technology that's really the problem, but it's the socio-cultural challenges that the women have to overcome to use these technologies. So what's your view about that?
So I think it really depends on where this technology is provided. There's been enough research to say that kiosk styles or interaction methods or something that's in a community space has been working really well with these rural women. Of course, you have to have an avenue for them to get there, But usually if something community-driven, then it's like, the honeypot effect. So if there's one woman who kind of is able to overcome that barrier and visit it, then she can spread the word to others. So when we design technology, especially for rural Indian women, we look at collaboration. We look at how the technology would not just be for the individual, but it can also be used by a group of them. So that's one of the ways that I think technology can be used. Does that answer your question to some extent?
We'll talk later.
Okay, sure.
While I could really understand the social interaction for the autistic children, on the illiterate women about their gestures, how do you get the data? Like if they touch their head, there could be many reasons why that is. So without a language interaction, how do you actually get to the problem at hand?
Right. So the idea with this was you would design the application, or you would design an application, and it would have a specific purpose, which they would need to know. So for instance, is it for recording symptoms? Then they would touch their head in that context. For this case, we had told them, or they had been briefed. So yeah, it's not completely like you walk up to it and you can use it. They would be a mediator who would explain why this is in place, but then they can use it by themselves. And the idea is that you only need that explanation once. That okay, this system is there to provide basic maternal health care, or this system will record your symptoms. It would be nice to be able to integrate them. You could use some sort of speech-based systems for that. You could also have, we had a 3D avatar, so that could be more dynamic in nature, and it could, you could have levels of interaction. So depending on if someone's been standing for a long time, then maybe you can, you can ask them, are they there to visit a doctor? Do they want to record their symptoms? So you could have this sort of speech interaction with them. So you would have to use something else except gestures for that. Yeah. Sorry? How does she get the information? So these were videos. Then we played a video, so it was visual and auditory. It's already preloaded in the system.
So is it just general information about pregnancy and things, or
Yes.
does it respond?
Yeah.
Something at their head or their stomach?
Right, right.
More interactive, like does it ask them questions?
Right. So this system was more about providing sort of basic general information, and you could record your questions, which the doctor could then answer over a voice message later on.
Oh, okay. So
Yeah.
the doctor will respond later on.
Yeah.
But for that response to come through to the women, do they have to stay in that center?
No, they don't. So the idea was that you could actually, you could have these user profiles based on the mobile phone of, a mobile phone. So you could have profiles of women. This was more like a proof of concept, but the potential, if you want to use the application for that space, then you would probably create user profiles where a woman comes in, records her symptoms. She may or may not wait for the doctor. She could go back, and then based on the sort of symptoms that were recorded, the doctor could, and she could record a question or a query that she has, and then the doctor could respond back later, and it will automatically be on her, as a voice message on her phone, which will be saved there, so she can listen to it again and again.
Okay,
So
very
you
cool.
would need, multiple ways to address those issues. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, this is Ranjita from Intel. So I had two questions. One related to the healthcare for the low literate women. So when you interact with these women, so they tell you which part of their body, but when the video plays, what language does it play in? Because in different rural areas, you have different languages which come into play, right?
Right.
So, yeah.
So it's the native dialect. You have to have somebody record it.
Okay, so that means like when it comes to India, you have so many
Yes.
native dialects, right?
Yeah.
So do you face any challenges there, or?
So yes, of course. I mean, if you want to be able to have scalability with that system, it is a bit challenging.
Right.
You would need somebody to record in the sort of, like I said, that dialect or
Right.
a different language. So there is a scalability issue with that, definitely. Yeah. So this is more of research. This is what,
yeah.
this is what technology can do. But of course, there are also a lot of other challenges.
That's right.
Yeah.
So the second was with respect to what you have done with the children with autism. So have you thought of extending it to patients with ailments like because of some medical condition they are unable to interact, or they are unable to speak, or they have some kind of say
Right.
paralysis or something, or so if they want to interact, can this be extended to that?
Right. So it's something that we haven't been working on, but there is a lot of work out there already done by other research groups. For
Okay.
instance, for people on, at least for gestures, there's been this case that for people on wheelchair, they could actually control the chair by tilting their head.
Right, right.
So they wear this headband and they can go left and right and forward
Okay.
using their head.
Okay.
So there's potential there. Of course, it
Right.
goes into wearable, not into so
Okay.
wearable gestures. But yeah, that's one way you could address
Right,
it. With the Kinect and with this technology, I think it would be a little difficult because you would need some way for them to communicate. They can communicate through gestures, but it would be limited to what the application is providing.
Okay.
You could have a gesture-based keyboard, but which would be very tiring. In fact, we have gaze-based keyboards that people have been using very successfully, and they become very efficient at it. It's a very different keyboard layout, and you can select the keys using your eyes. So there's a technology there where you can wear it. It can be with glasses, or it's a camera-based technology. It could be on the monitor or the device. So it kind of tracks the retina and sees where it's looking on a sort of a display. And then it can make selections based on use dwell time and other sort of modes to select specific maybe letters or alphabets or words. And the thing is, the system also learns with the user. So, it's like predictive analysis that happens with sort of, sort of use over time that, they can guess, almost like something like your dictionary or something on your phone. So those sort of technologies have kind of worked better when people are completely unable to express themselves. Gestures would work maybe in conjunction with one of those, not independently, I guess.
Thanks.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Oh.
So I think this should be the last question. We have another talk in the same session, so you can continue the conversations with her.
Yeah, so my question is, very often people who aren't already familiar with technology, they have a hard time understanding the interface itself, right? So for a woman trying to use that medical application, say, you might give her a brief overview of the whole application in the beginning, but even if she faces a small, even if she's not able to do something small, she'll be stuck there. So don't you think you'll be hitting a roadblock somewhere down the way? Or say an old person, like I try to explain my grandma's tab to her, and she gets a small thing and she just panics. So how do you handle that?
Yeah, so there are definitely these challenges in roadblocks. In fact, one of the things that we experienced with our system was that the visual information that we provided closely resembled X-rays. So there was a woman who was trying to select the head and it would not work. And she went back thinking that there's something wrong with her own head. That, you know, when you say the system is tracking you, they think that it's tracking your entire skeleton and it's giving you this sort of real-time feedback, which it wasn't. It wasn't such an intelligent system. So you do have these very different mental models of people who are using technology. And like you said, you know, if something goes wrong, how do they react? How can we overcome that? Those are still challenges that we're working on. So, you know, a lot of this research happens with moderators to help in those scenarios and tell, you know, in this case, the woman that, no, it was not your head, it's the fault of the system. Because a lot of times what happens is when technology doesn't work, you have this habit of blaming yourself. I'm too stupid, I don't know how to do this. But it's actually the technology's fault. It should have addressed that issue. And that's the sort of mantra behind HCI. You know, that's why the human comes first. It's human who are interacting with computers, and the computer should be smart enough to know what the human is going to do next or how to resolve issues. But of course, there's just so many challenges that it becomes very difficult to address all of them. So we kind of, you know, like pick our battles and figure out which ones would affect the most. But yeah, so this is like the potential of technology. How it will be incorporated and what sort of challenges happen in the long run, I think we're yet to find those out.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
So that was really interesting, isn't it? We talk about the Microsoft Kinect in the context of a gaming console, you know, dancing and fitness and gaming. But to hear about using Kinect for such deep social impact, that was awesome. Thank you so much for that presentation. From moving on to from the gestures part of it, about how to use gestures for communication and overcoming language barriers, how about overcoming language barriers while talking? How about talking when you don't know a language? How about talking with people with different languages in the same room? That's about live translation. Just typing in and getting a translated text back, that is passé. We all know it, we all use it. But when I am talking in live, if there is a program, a machine that translates it for you right there, that's something awesome, isn't it? The Skype translator does that. And we have Tanvi from Microsoft. She works in the Microsoft Research Group on machine translation to take us through all the magic that machine translation can do for us. Welcome, Tanvi.
Hi everyone, my name is Tanvi, and a part of what I do for work is talk to strangers on Skype. I lucked out, I have a great job. So 3 times a week I spend 30 minutes talking to a person who doesn't speak English, whom I've never met before, who lives in a completely different country, just to chit-chat about our lives. So the reason for this is I work at Microsoft Research with this amazing team of people on a product called Skype Translator, where we enable people to have normal conversations over a regular Skype call. Only difference, both people are speaking completely different languages, and our software is live translating what they're saying for them. And over these countless phone calls and hours and hours of watching other people conduct Skype translator calls, I want to share some learnings that we've come away with. First, in the science of translation, so what does it take to produce translations quickly and in high quality? And 2, the art of translation. So the human experience of a live translated call. What are some of the user expectations from conversation flow? Or how do users react to translation mistakes? So before we get into that, I know that not everyone in the audience is familiar with what we mean by conversational speech translation. So I'm playing a quick clip of the Skype translator in use. Is there audio?
Hi, can you guess where I live?
¿Te encuentras en América del Norte?
Yes. Do you live in central Mexico?
Sí. ¿Te encuentras en Estados Unidos de América?
Yes. Do you live in a capital city?
Sí. ¿Estás cerca de Seattle?
You're very close to Seattle. Are you in Mexico City?
Sí. ¿Estás en Tacoma?
Yes. Very good guess.
Gracias.
Thank you.
Do you like living in Mexico City?
¿Te gusta vivir en la Ciudad de México?
Aquí está muy lindo.
Here is very nice.
What do you do for fun?
¿Qué haces para divertirte?
Voy a las playas de México.
I'm going to the beaches of Mexico.
I like to swim.
Me gusta nadar.
A mí también.
Me too.
Where in the world do you wish to travel?
¿A dónde en el mundo te gustaría viajar?
A Rusia.
To Russia.
¿Y tú?
And you?
Everywhere.
Sería increíble algún día verte en México.
It would be amazing to see you someday in Mexico.
I would really like to visit you sometime.
Me gustaría mucho visitarte algún día.
A mí también.
Me too.
So I love that clip because that so beautifully encapsulates what speech translation can actually do for us. So now that we have a sense of what now that we have a sense of what conversational speech translation looks like, I would like to pitch to the room why this is important. So if you look at the distribution of primary languages spoken around the world, Mandarin, English, Hindi, Spanish, Arabic, Portuguese being the top ones, we realize that the world today is more divided on language barriers than geographical barriers. Language is a huge impediment for the world to effectively communicate with one another and as a result effectively do business together or socialize together. One of my favorite anecdotes around the need for translation is around the American president Jimmy Carter going to Japan in the year 1981, and he was giving a speech at a conference like this to a primarily Japanese audience. And everyone looked really tensed, so he decided to start his speech with a joke. So he tells this like long, belabored joke and has this really funny punchline. And after he tells the joke, his interpreter repeats the same joke in Japanese, and the whole room like explodes into laughter, right? So the president's really impressed, like his joke never landed this well before. So after the speech, he goes to his interpreter and says, you know, how did you translate my joke? Like it was obviously very successful. And the interpreter goes, I said, President Carter has told a funny story, everyone must laugh now. And that, to me, perfectly encapsulates the need for translation because there is so much that is lost in our inability to understand each other effectively. Furthermore, if you look at some of the biggest economies in the world today, China, Japan, India, we see that 90% of Chinese citizens speak no English, and this serves as an impediment for them to do business with the English-speaking world. 70% of Japanese citizens are monolingual, and they're hosting the 2020 Olympics where millions of people are going to be in their country. Even in India, we speak more than 50 major languages, and communication is a barrier in India even across state lines. More recently, with the Syrian crisis, the huge influx of refugees in Europe, Germany itself is expecting 1 million refugees to enter Germany in the year 2016, and these are people who speak no German. So obviously, there is a need globally for us to effectively communicate with each other without the use of human translators. Furthermore, we did some business studies around the importance of translation, and we queried about 3,000 people. About 50% of them say that in the last 12 months, they've had some kind of need for speech translation products. So not only is there a humanitarian need for translation, there is clearly also a business need for it. So, okay, I made my pitch, like there is a market for translation. But what goes behind making a product like this work? And why are we talking about this now? Why is speech conversational translation important now? So until very recently, this wasn't very feasible, and the main blocker was speech recognition. So speech recognition initially started in the very limited domain of being able to say a couple of words, very domain-specific words. Then it evolved into other things like GPS navigation. Then it came to Siri, like personal assistants. And finally, we are at a point with the advent of deep neural networks and machine learning where automatic speech recognition can be used in technology like Skype and work very effectively with conversational speech translation, where people have a much wider breadth and depth of vocabulary. So, what goes into building a translation product is we chain together the speech recognition models with the MT or the text translation models, and then the text-to-speech models to create a full pipeline of taking an audio clip, like in this scenario, person one is saying hello, converting that into the text, H-E-L-L-O, then translating it into the text, H-O-L-A, hola, and then applying text-to-speech algorithms on it to convert that text into a Spanish word. So all this needs to be happening in real time for us to effectively take an utterance in one language and take that audio and convert it to an utterance in another language. So by being able to chain all these things together and by being able to do all this quickly, we have now reached a point where big companies like Google, Microsoft, Intel, etc. are spending millions of dollars in building bi-directional speech translation products that does all of this and does all of this in real time. However, we quickly realized that these components by themselves are not enough to perform effective translation. The problem is how users speak. So when we talk, we think we are talking fairly fluently, but often what is being said is quite different from what we think we are saying in our head. So here is an example where I might be trying to say, yeah, it was worth it, but what I'm actually saying in normal conversational speech is, yeah, but yeah, I guess it was worth it. Yeah, I guess. So when we actually speak, it's such a word salad of disfluencies and ums and repetitions that doesn't make for good input into a translation model. So in the second scenario, what was actually recognized, if we fed that to a machine learning model, the resulting translation would just be nonsense. So the missing piece for us to actually build the pipeline for Skype Translator was a speech recognition algorithm. So current MT technology is based on translating grammatically well-formed, well-punctuated sentences. And the problem is that people don't talk like that, right? So as a result, when we don't talk like that, the output is not necessarily grammatical and hard for your partner to understand. So what we do with speech correction is we normalize the text. We add punctuation, we add pauses, we insert casing, we remove disfluencies like, like, yeah. And furthermore, we remove repetitions. So a lot of what we say, we end up repeating ourselves, and we remove all the redundant words from a sentence, create a correctly structured grammatical sentence before feeding it to a machine translation model. So eventually, the architecture of Skype Translator looks something like this. When the user first speaks, there is an automatic speech recognition algorithm. Then there is a speech correction algorithm that cleans up the jumble of words that were recognized. After it was correctly, after the speech is corrected, we then put it to the translation model, which performs the translation, and then finally back to a text-to-speech model that says it back out loud. And imagine doing all of this within milliseconds, because for a performant Skype conversation, all this needs to happen extremely quickly. So in addition to correcting the output of ASR, machine translation needs to also be trained on data that is less formal and more conversational, so that the expectations are more closely matched with what we usually say in casual conversations with one another. So a lot of the training data that goes into machine learning models for both speech recognition and MT is something like the text you see on the top. Parliament speeches, extremely formal written text. This doesn't make for a very good translation if we are just speaking casually with friends. So what we see at the bottom, like, he ain't my choice, but hey, we hated the last guy, or we're going to hit it and quit it, the kind of like informality that comes in human conversation, we needed that kind of data to actually perform high quality translations. So one of the big challenges for us to build a good conversational speech translation model is spending many, many months collecting phone conversational data or having vendors speak on Skype and then us correcting and transcribing that data in order to feed our machine learning models with the right kind of conversational data we needed for Skype. So that was the science behind Skype Translator, and while that's really interesting, what was personally very appealing to me about this problem is the experience and the questions around the user interface of a speech translation software. So at first glance, you might ask, why are we even talking about user experience, right? That's not the hard problem here. And in fact, this is a problem area where we need to worry about machine learning and data and so forth. Why are we talking about user experience? What was surprising to us, though, is once we had the first version of Skype Translator out, an overwhelming number of people seemed to have more objections with the user experience of it all than the actual quality. Because people came in with some expectations that the quality is not quite there, but when the user experience fails or when the software is slow, that's what caused users to not come back and use the product. So we clearly got very early indications that there is something with the UI here, or there is something with the experience here that we need to think more deeply about. So today I want to share like the 3 big learnings, and we've learned a lot over the last couple of years, but the 3 big learnings that we've come away with around designing conversational speech translation products, and give you some examples of how we got there. So our first reaction to building a Skype Translator was, let's look at how human translators behave, right? So in this picture, the Chinese premier is speaking with the Microsoft CEO, Satya Nadella, and there is a translator in the middle, and she's conveying what the premier said to Satya Nadella. So we looked at how human translators did their job and said, okay, let's build a software that does exactly that. So for us to understand how that works, let's think about how a human translator works, right? First, person A utters a sentence. The human translator processes it, and when there is a clear indication that the person A has finished speaking, because the human translator would never interrupt, the human translator orally relays the translation to person B. Now, person A and person B know they should never interrupt the translator, or they should not speak at the same time because the human translator would not be able to process both things at the same time. So eventually they'll enter a very natural cadence of person A, translation, person B translation, person A. So we said, okay, great, let's do exactly that. So our first designs for conversational translations had a very clear turn-taking model. So person A would speak, and then the translation would play out loud, and then the turn would switch to person B. So no one was speaking at the same time, and there was a clear kind of ping-pong match between both participants. So early user feedback quickly showed that emulating human translators was failing for us as a model, because this model is very dissimilar to how people actually speak, right? So think about, like, this quote in the bottom in particular was insightful for me, that, you know, this technology is really great, but there just wasn't a flow in the conversation. So human translators are not rhythmic, especially over extended periods of time. Think about the last conversation you had with a friend or a family member. People interrupt each other, people interject with a yes or a or a no, or people speak over each other, or some people have a huge monologue and then the other person interjects quickly. So instead of trying to artificially create this like sectored conversation, we decided that we needed to mold ourselves closer to natural human conversation. So the improvement, the feature we invested in is what we call continuous recognition. So we shouldn't change human behavior, but adjust to it. People can talk at any given times. Utterance can be, the utterances that people are speaking would be concurrently recognized and displayed in the order in which they were spoken. And finally, translation shouldn't wait till the end of the user having finished spoken. So we shouldn't wait politely till the user has finished their long monologue and then attempt to translate it. As we start to recognize parts of what was said, we start to pop all of that in so that the user has an understanding of what is being said before that utterance has been completed. So the second problem we experienced is with automatic speech translation. As Prerna said, there are two people talking, but really four voices in the room. The user's translated voice, the person they're talking to, and their translated voice. And this gets extremely overwhelming to hear, especially over extended periods of time. You're hearing four voices within one Skype call, and there's just two people. In fact, in the usability study, one of my favorite examples from a participant was he felt like it was watching Arnab. Everyone was talking at the same time, but like he didn't get anything away from it. He just felt anxious. So the first thing we experimented with is giving users, removing the audio in the opposite language. So if I was the English speaker, I wouldn't hear the Spanish translation, nor would I hear the original Spanish of the person I was talking to, because that was completely irrelevant to me since I didn't speak the language. However, it turns out that that wasn't super popular because now users didn't know what their social cues were for their time to talk. So if I didn't hear what my partner said, or if I didn't hear when my partner finished speaking, even though it was in a language I didn't understand, I didn't know it was my turn to speak. So even though the users were not actually understanding the audio, they were using the audio as social cues for their turns. So that didn't end up working. The solution we then discovered is a technique called audio ducking. And this is used on radios where DJs try to speak over the music. So the volume is lowered on the irrelevant audio, and volume is increased on the audio that's relevant to the user. But the lowered volume is just high enough that the user knows it exists. So as I said, with audio ducking, the solution that ended up, and this solution really ended up working for us, is always lower the volume on the translation of the user's own utterance, and when there is overlapping audio, reduce the volume on the language the user doesn't understand. So that brings me to the end of lesson 1. So the overall kind of umbrella takeaway for me was we need to weave translation into natural human conversations, and that's the only way this product will end up being sticky. And we did that with continuous recognition instead of forcing users to take turn, and 2, with audio ducking to avoid overwhelming the user. The second discovery was that Skype Translator can get extremely profane, especially when no offense is met. So the reason this happens is in perfectly civil conversations when no bad words are being said, due to the frequency of profanity in the training data, we end up adding bad words when they were never said. So as a result, you could be having a perfectly civil conversation and then there is a bad word. So obviously we needed a band-aid for this. We couldn't be putting curse words out there, especially when they were never said to begin with and in a translated conversation. So here's what we did. We took a database of bad words, and these are language specific. And every time there was a match with this table of bad words, we decided to add a beep instead. So the reason we can't completely eliminate the profanity is sometimes it's a subject of a sentence. So like you can say, what the hell? If you remove hell from that sentence, it's just what the. That doesn't make any sense, right? So we needed to have some kind of placeholder for the profanity. So of course, we use asterisks in the text itself, but we also needed some filler in the audio. So my team and I spent a really odd day. We tried and tested a lot of beeps in different frequencies and volumes to find out the right beep that was appropriate to add when there was a profanity introduced. So that's lesson number 2. We needed to eliminate profanity from the conversation, especially when it was unintended. Lesson number 3. So speech recognition is not a perfect science, and first-time users are quickly hitting scenarios where something they said is completely misrecognized and their partner completely misunderstands them. And this is especially a problem when you don't speak each other's languages, so it's really hard to backtrack to the last good point of the conversation. So this is a story I'm really embarrassed to tell, but I think it really illustrates this. This one time I was talking to a middle-aged lady who was speaking in Spanish, and I don't speak a word of Spanish. And we were discussing, our bucket lists and what are the kinds of things we want to do. And suddenly the translation says, "I want to kiss someone on a mountain." And that was really awkward and got really annoying very quickly. So I was like, okay, these are misrecognitions, and she doesn't realize what was translated. So obviously, we need some kind of solution for users to deal with misrecognitions. So translation, or using a conversational translation product, can be a little bit like a game of Chinese whispers, right? So things that you're saying can get misrecognized, and the misunderstanding can snowball as the conversation proceeds. And unlike most products where you hope that as long as the users are in a happy path, they're not going to hit major errors. Yet while designing for translation products, especially speech translation products where there can be misrecognitions and mistranslations, we need to equip and prepare the users to handle errors. And not just set those expectations, but also teach them what you need to do once you do hit an error. So the solutions we worked on are divided into two: prevention and cure. So in the prevention aspect of things, in a typical lifetime of an utterance, if I were to speak and I was talking to, let's say, a Chinese person, when I spoke and I finished my utterance, I need to remember to read my recognition. If I don't read the English recognition of what I said, and if that was incorrect, most certainly the translation is going to be completely off the mark. So the first thing we did is we had to educate users. It was really important for them to read their recognition. The second thing we taught them to do is, okay, now you've realized that what you said was misrecognized, and therefore you know it was mistranslated. It's now time for you to rephrase what was misrecognized or state it again. So by laying the onus of responsibility of correcting themselves on the person who spoke, we raise the user's confidence in the product. So we are saying, okay, this is what you said, this is what we understood, and therefore you can assume with reasonable confidence that the translation is somewhat related to what was recognized. Solution number 2 is cure. So this is what I call the infinite loop of conversational death. There is a bad recognition that's not corrected by the speaker, then or a mistranslation that gets unnoticed, or mistranslation that results in an unrelated response to a previous utterance. So that conversation kind of just devolves. So there are a couple of things we do to teach users that they need to go back to the last good state of the conversation. So we do a lot of pop-ups telling users that they need to repeat what they're saying until they got them right. However, this doesn't work very effectively for entities and proper nouns. So for example, if I was saying, I live in Thiruvananthapuram, there is no way speech recognition is going to get Thiruvananthapuram right, because it's a proper noun, and an obscure proper noun at that. So we encourage users to strike through. So we give users a feature to go back to a previous utterance and strike it through, and encourage them to type instead. And what that does is it also lets us grab an audio clip and map it to the corrected recognition for it, which also goes back to feed into our speech recognition algorithms. A feature that we would like to add is being able to tag your partner's utterance with question marks, saying, okay, that made no sense to me, I don't know how to convey that to you. So some kind of button for me to say, what, that didn't make any sense. So lesson number 3 is, this is a kind of software where users are inevitably going to have mistakes. So we need to equip users to deal with both misrecognitions and mistranslations. So 1, we teach users to expect errors and monitor their recognition. And 2, we provide an exit condition when a translation is nonsensical. So that brings me to my conclusion. We thought that the biggest problem with building Skype Translator would be the quality of translation. But what's equally hard, if not harder, is managing people's psychology and expectations of what's reasonable from an automatic translation software. Users are really fickle, and people go so quickly from, oh my God, you've built automatic translation, to why doesn't this thing work perfectly all the time? And that shift of attitude towards the software happens extremely quickly. So we eventually want to get to a sweet spot giving people enough confidence in this technology to trust it for sustained conversations without expecting the kind of perfection they might see in science fiction. And the way to make our products stick is, yes, through quality, but also through user experience. By enveloping translation services with the right user experience that feels natural to the user, that doesn't remove the human element from the conversation and makes it feel robotic, teaches them not to expect perfection, and then gives them an error when they don't see perfection. So we are doing a Skype translator demo later today at the Microsoft booth. So for folks who want to actually see this in action, please come by and you can try this for yourself. Thank you. Any questions? Yeah.
So we use Microsoft Hub for the translation, MT Engines. So my first question is, how frequently do you train the MT Engines? And do you have different success rates for different languages? For example, I've realized we have a good success rate for fixed BR languages. It's Finnish, Italian, Spanish, German, and Brazilian Portuguese. And it's very less for multi-byte languages like Japanese. And so how do you address that? And if I can, I'll add one more question. Especially for how do you break your sentence strings? For example, in Japanese, they don't have a period or a comma and all this. So we have implemented this kind of a real-time translation in our support systems, where your customer can be from any part of the world and they are interacting, and the support engineer sitting in India is providing the answers in English and they can see it in their respective language. So we faced a problem with the multi-byte languages. So do you have any suggestions on how you are addressing that?
Yeah, absolutely. So your first question was around the roadmap and how do we prioritize which languages we retrain. That is entirely a function of the availability of data. So as you correctly pointed out, for the FIGS languages, there is a lot of data available, and as a result, those languages get trained more frequently. Right now on our roadmap, we prioritize languages by how many people speak that language. So based on the priorities, the business priorities of the team, those languages get bubbled up. Your second question is around word breakers specifically for Japanese. I can't particularly speak to that, but I'll give you a contact on my team who can. Yeah. So see me after. Yes.
Hi. So I have two questions. One is sometimes in the same conversation, people speak two languages, like I am used to speaking Kannada and English in the same line. So how do you solve that? Like it can try to recognize English word as Kannada and then translate to something else. The second question is, there are words that mean different things. So how do you get the context? No, actually my second question is, how do you get the expression, whether it's a question, when we say, you mean this, it's actually a question, not a sentence. How do you resolve that?
Okay, so your first question is around users who are multilingual and say words of different languages within the same utterance. That's a great question, and it's an unsolved problem, but Kalika up here sitting in the front row is actually working on that. So right now, if on Skype Translator, if you say a sentence like, what is happening yaar, it's not going to recognize the Hindi component. But that is certainly something we are working towards. It's solvable in the text space, but it makes it it's really challenging to solve it in the speech space.
Called code switching, when you mix two or multiple languages, and it's a very difficult problem. It's still a research problem, but we are working on that. Right. Yeah, English is, English. Right. And Tamilish, and however many Ilish you want.
And your second question is, how do we get the context of something what was said based on the usage of the word? And that is one of the things that deep neural networks do, is that they understand how a word is enveloped and in what kind of sentence it was said, and based on that, the translation differs. For punctuation, we use probabilistic models. So for example, if I say, I live here, I live here, there is no way for us to necessarily distinguish that. There are certain ways in which some sentences are formulated that we know that it's a question. But that, again, is an extremely hard problem. We do some work around it in our speech correction normalization algorithms.
Hi. Folks, we are out of time, so we'll have to call it a break here. But feel free to catch Tanvi after the session. We have a small gift for you. Thank you.